next story I'm going to read about George and Martha is called The Experiment. My grandkids like to do experiments with me. Martha was in her laboratory. "What are you doing?" asked George. "I'm studying fleas," said Martha. "Cute little critters," said George. "You don't understand," said Martha. "This is serious. This is science." The next day, George noticed that Martha was scratching a lot. She really looked uncomfortable. Oh, what do you think might have happened? George brought Martha some special soap, and after her shower, Martha felt much better. "I think I'll stop studying fleas," said Martha. "Good idea," said George. "I think I'll study bees instead," said Martha. "Oh dear," said George. She could get stung by the bees, couldn't she? There's one other story I want to read you. This is not about hippos, but this is about an elephant. A second chance for Tina. And this is based on a true story. This is the story of how a little girl named Rebecca helped to save a big elephant named Tina. When Rebecca was 8 years old, she lived in New York City with her family. Every Wednesday after school, Rebecca and her grandpa Arthur visited the Central Park Zoo. It was one of Rebecca's favorite things to do, and her favorite animal in the zoo was an Asian elephant named Tina. It's fun to go to the zoo, isn't it? When I was a little girl, I went to Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. Tina always waved her trunk when she saw Rebecca. The little girl always fed her peanuts. Tina's keeper was a man named Bob, and he let Rebecca give Tina a pail of raw beets, the elephant's favorite snack. Rebecca learned all about Tina from Bob, and he told her that Tina had come to the zoo from Asia when she was just 5 years old. She had been put in a cage with a much larger and older elephant named Julia, but Julia had died a short time ago. Tina was very sad without Julia. "I'm the only friend she has now," Bob told Rebecca, "except, of course, when you come to visit." When Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur came on their next visit, Bob was not there. Tina was in the corner of her cage, and she wouldn't come over to the bars to say hello. Something was very wrong. Grandpa Arthur asked one of the other keepers where he could find Bob. "I'm so sorry," said the keeper, "but I have some really sad news about Bob. He suddenly became very ill and died, and we all miss him a great deal." Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur were very, very unhappy. Bob had been so kind to them and to Tina. "Who will take care of Tina now?" Rebecca asked. "Well," the keeper said sadly, "that's a big problem. Tina is so unhappy about losing both Julia and Bob that she won't let anyone else near her. Last week she tried to crush the arm of one keeper. Then she stepped on the foot of another, and they were only trying to feed her. Now we have to push her food through the cage door." Oh, poor Tina. Rebecca was very upset. "What will happen to her?" she asked. "I honestly don't know," the keeper said. "You see, the zoo is closing soon. A better zoo will be built in its place. That means that all of the animals have to be placed in other zoos for now. Everyone has been adopted so far except Tina. Zookeepers from all over the world have come to see her, but they won't take her when they see how angry she is." Oh my goodness, what's going to happen? "Oh no," said Rebecca. "What happens if no one takes her?" The keeper said that Tina would have to be destroyed if no one could be found to save her. Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur walked sadly to Tina's cage. Tears were on Rebecca's cheeks as she held up a handful of peanuts for Tina to see. After a few minutes, Tina seemed to recognize her old friends and slowly lumbered over to the cage doors. She took the peanuts and offered her trunk for Rebecca to stroke. "You see, Grandpa, she still knows us. She knows we love her," said Rebecca, blinking back tears. "Too bad we don't have room for an elephant at home," said Grandpa Arthur, trying to make Rebecca smile. That night, Rebecca lay awake worrying. She had to do something to help. She was only 8 years old, but who would listen to her? The next morning the phone rang. It was Grandpa Arthur. "Sweetheart, I have an idea about Tina. Why not write to people who can help save her? Let's send letters to the zoo, the newspaper, the mayor. What do you think?" Rebecca was excited. Just the thought of doing something to help took some of the sadness away. It made her feel grown up and useful. That afternoon, Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur wrote their letters. They wrote the New York Times, the mayor of the New York City, the commissioner of parks, and the Zoological Society. Rebecca sealed the envelopes and licked the stamps. Grandpa Arthur held the mailbox slot open as she slid the envelopes inside and made a wish. 1 week went by, then Grandpa Arthur called Rebecca. "Guess what, honey? The New York Times printed your letter this morning." There it was in black and white. Rebecca was so excited she could hardly sit still in school that day. Her teacher, Mrs. Eldridge, posted the letter on the bulletin board. That's exciting. During the next few days, letters came to Rebecca from the mayor, the parks commissioner, the Zoological Society. They all promised to help. Now I'm not the only one who cares, Rebecca thought. At least that's something. But time was running out. The zoo was going to close in 2 weeks, and still no one had offered to take Tina. Rebecca was so worried she couldn't think about anything else. She even missed 3 easy words on her spelling test. Then on their next visit, Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur were surprised to see a stranger in Tina's cage, and he was feeding her raw beets. Best of all, Tina was letting him stroke her trunk. Look at that. That was exciting. Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur watched while Tina finished the last of her snack. The stranger gave her trunk a final pat. He picked up the empty pail and came out of the cage. "You must be Rebecca," he said. "I've heard a lot about you. It's a pleasure to meet a fellow elephant lover." Rebecca thought he had the nicest smile she'd ever seen. No wonder Tina trusted him. His name was David Blasco, but he said most people called him Dave, and he worked at Six Flags Marine World in California. Dave told Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur that he had read their letter in the New York Times. He had arrived at the Central Park Zoo several days earlier. He had spent the first few days gently talking to Tina and feeding her treats from outside her cage. At first, Tina refused to come out of her corner. Then slowly she began to trust him and take the treats he offered. Finally, that very morning, Dave decided to enter the cage. He knew he could help Tina if she did not attack him. "I think she's just very lonely. After all, she lost her 2 closest friends, her cage mate and her keeper." At last, thought Rebecca, someone who really understands elephants, especially Tina. Tina did let Dave into the cage, which was a big relief to everyone. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. "Well, we take Tina out to our new home in California. We'll drive her across the country in a special van." He winked at Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur. "Would you like to come?" Rebecca looked up at Grandpa Arthur. "Oh, could we?" she whispered. "Well, I don't know, honey. Aren't you forgetting something important like school?" "But next week is spring vacation, Grandpa. We could fly home in time for school again." "Oh, pretty please, she pleaded, jumping up and down. Grandpa Arthur thought for a moment. "Well, I guess you could say that this trip will be a good life lesson. We'll go." They'd leave the following Monday and take several days to cross the country. Rebecca was so excited she couldn't sleep the night before the trip. She and Grandpa arrived at the zoo at 6 o'clock. And they saw a huge van backed up to Tina's cage door. A ramp was lowered so she could be led into the van. Rebecca was surprised to see a crowd of people waiting nearby. She recognized other keepers and the park commissioner. There was also a reporter and a photographer from the New York Times. Dave introduced Rebecca and Grandpa to his boss, Peter, who had come from California to help. They also met Frank, the driver of the van, and another trainer named Jim. But the biggest surprise of all was Rebecca's teacher, Mrs. Eldridge, and her entire 3rd grade class. They had come to see Rebecca and Tina off on their big adventure. How exciting is that? The commissioner walked over to Rebecca. So this is the famous letter writer, he said, smiling and shaking her hand. You are really something, young lady. Without your hard work, we might have never found a new home for Tina. Rebecca blushed and Grandpa Arthur smiled proudly. Dave explained to the group that Tina had been given medicine to make her calm and sleepy. This would help them lead her easily into the van. After all, he told them Tina had not been out of her cage in many years, and Dave didn't want to frighten her. Everything was ready. Dave opened the cage door and started to lead Tina up the ramp. Rebecca crossed her fingers and held her breath. Suddenly, halfway up the ramp, Tina yawned, sat down with a big thud, and guess what she did? She fell asleep. The keepers could not move her. What do you do when an elephant falls asleep? Rebecca discovered you just wait until she decides to wake up. She and Grandpa Arthur sat down on a bench to wait and to listen to Tina snore. Mrs. Eldridge and the class left the park. The commissioner had to go back to his office, and the zookeepers had to take care of other animals. Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they even napped a little bit too. And then suddenly, what do you think happened? Just when they were beginning to wonder if Tina would ever open her eyes, she yawned an elephant-sized yawn and slowly got to her feet. Dave led her the rest of the way into the van, and he and Jim put her safely in place. Frank climbed into the driver's seat with Rebecca beside him. Grandpa Arthur, Dave, and Jim rode in the back to watch Tina and keep her company. They all waved goodbye and slowly drove away. Oh, that's such good news. The trip went smoothly, even though there was a snowstorm in the Dakotas. The grown-ups took turns reading the map and caring for Tina. Finally, they reached Six Flags Marine World. It was a beautiful, sunny California morning. Dave had phoned ahead to tell his keepers that Tina would be arriving. He asked them to line up the park's 10 other elephants to greet Tina when she arrived. Oh, Rebecca was so happy to hear that Tina would not be living in a cage. The elephant's new home was a wonderful jungle area, much like her own native country. Dave explained to Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur that elephants are friendly animals, and the company of other animals is very important to them. But Dave was worried because Tina had been alone for so long. Would she know that the other elephants were her friends, or would they only frighten her? Everyone waited nervously as the van's ramp was lowered. The waiting elephants took one look at Tina in the van. They raised their trunks and they trumpeted a very loud welcome. That was a good beginning indeed. Oh, how exciting. Now it was Tina's turn. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The seconds ticked slowly by, and finally, Tina lifted her trunk and she trumpeted back. Everyone cheered. Rebecca and Grandpa Arthur hugged each other, and then they both hugged Dave. They had taken a chance, and it had worked. Tina had a new home and new friends, and she had been given a second chance at life. It was a very happy ending for what could have been a very sad story. It just goes to show, Grandpa, said Rebecca, you should never give up hope, even if you're an elephant. Oh, what a wonderful story, a second chance for Tina. And so I'm going to say goodbye and good night, and I'm going to throw you a kiss. Did you catch them all? They were fast tonight. I love you. Bye.
Amen.